In the furthest reaches of the known world, where the Jade Sea laps against shores that few Westerosi have ever seen, there once rose an empire so vast, so ancient, that even the dragon lords of Valyria were mere children in comparison. This is the story of Yiti, the Golden Empire of the East, a civilization whose origins stretch back into the mists of time, to an age when the world itself was young and the very gods walked among men. To speak of Yiti is to speak of legends that predate the oldest histories of Westeros. While the first men were still carving their runes into weirwood trees and the Andals had not yet crossed the narrow sea, Yitai already stood as a monument to human ambition and divine will. Its cities gleamed with gold and jade, its emperors commanded millions, and its scholars mapped the stars with a precision that would not be matched for thousands of years. But every empire, no matter how golden its age, begins with humble origins. Every dynasty, no matter how divine its claim, rises from the chaos of what came before. To understand Yi Ti, we must journey back to the very beginning, to a time when the world was fundamentally different, when magic flowed more freely and the boundaries between the mortal and the divine were not yet firmly drawn. The Meisters of the Citadel, in their gray chains and their certainty, might dismiss what follows as mere myth and legend. They would say that the stories of the great empire of the dawn are nothing more than the fantasies of ancient peoples trying to explain their own existence. But in the Far East, among the scholars of Yin and the sages who tend the temples, these are not legends. These are histories, passed down through countless generations, preserved in texts older than any tome in Westeros. According to these ancient records, long before Yitai, there existed an empire even greater, even more magnificent. They called it the Great Empire of the Dawn, and it stretched from the Jade Sea to the Grey Waste, from the mountains of the Morn to the Bleeding Sea. This was not merely an empire of men. This was an age when the gods themselves ruled over humanity, when the divine and the mortal were one. The first ruler of this primordial empire was said to be the god on earth, a being of such power and wisdom that his very presence brought order to chaos. He was neither fully god nor fully man, but something in between, something that the world would never see again. He ruled for 10,000 years, the legends say. Though whether this is literal truth or the poetic exaggeration of ancient scribes, none can say for certain. What is certain is that his reign established the foundations upon which all Eastern civilization would be built. After the god on earth came the Pearl Emperor, whose reign lasted another 1,000 years. He was followed by the Jade Emperor, the Tourmaline Emperor, the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Opal Emperor, each ruling in succession, each adding to the glory of the great empire of the dawn. These were the god emperors, beings who were said to possess powers that modern men can scarcely imagine. They commanded the elements, spoke with the spirits of the earth, and read the future in the movements of the stars, but it was not to last. Nothing golden ever does. The eighth ruler of this ancient dynasty was known as the Amethyst Empress, and by all accounts, she was beloved by her people and favored by the gods themselves. She should have ruled in peace and prosperity, continuing the unbroken line of divine succession that had brought order to the world. But fate, or perhaps the ambition of men, had other plans. The Amethyst Empress had a younger brother, and this brother coveted what was not his to claim. In an act that would echo through the ages, that would reshape the very fabric of the world, he cast down his sister. Some say he murdered her with his own hands. Others claim he used sorcery, binding her spirit so that even in death she could not find rest. The details vary depending on which ancient text you consult, but the outcome is always the same. The brother took the throne that should never have been his, and in doing so, he earned a name that would be cursed for all time, the Bloodstone Emperor. The reign of the Bloodstone Emperor was an abomination. He cast down the old gods that his ancestors had worshipped and raised up in their place a black stone that had fallen from the sky. He practiced dark arts and necromancy. He feasted on human flesh and drank the blood of his enemies. Under his rule, the great empire of the dawn descended into horror and madness, and the world itself recoiled. The heavens grew dark. The sun hid its face. The legends say that a generation was born and lived and died without ever seeing the light of day. In Westeros, they call this time the Long Night, and they tell tales of the others coming down from the frozen wastes with their swords of ice and their eyes like blue stars. But in the Far East, in Yiti and the lands beyond, they have their own names for this darkness. They speak of the Lion of Night, the great evil that was unleashed when the natural order was violated, when the Bloodstone Emperor committed his great sin against heaven and earth. What happened to the great empire of the Dawn during this terrible time, none can say with certainty. The records from that age are fragmentary at best, corrupted by time and disaster. When the sun finally returned, when the long night ended, and the world remembered warmth and light, the great empire of the Dawn was no more. It had shattered into 100 kingdoms, each ruled by warlords and petty kings, each fighting the others for scraps of what had once been whole. For centuries, perhaps millennia, chaos reigned in the east. The great cities fell into ruin. The works of the god emperors crumbled, and were reclaimed by the jungle and the sea. Knowledge was lost. Wisdom was forgotten. The people, who had once been united under divine rule, now slaughtered each other over boundaries and grievances that no one could remember the origin of. But from this chaos, slowly, painfully, a new order began to emerge. In the city of Yin, which had survived the collapse better than most, a new line of rulers began to consolidate power. They were not god emperors. They made no claim to divine blood or supernatural powers. They were simply men, but they were men with vision, with the ability to unite where others could only divide. They looked at the ruins of the past and saw not an ending, but a beginning. They would build something new, something that would rival even the great empire of the Dawn. The first of these rulers to truly deserve the title of emperor was known to history as the Azure Emperor. He was a warrior, a diplomat, and a sage, all in one. Through a combination of military conquest and strategic alliances, he brought the warring kingdoms under his banner. He did not merely conquer, he convinced. He showed the other rulers that unity was strength, that together they could rebuild what had been lost, that they could create something worthy of their ancestors. The Azure Emperor established his capital at Yin, on the shores of the Jade Sea, where the ruins of an ancient city provided the foundation for something new and magnificent. He built palaces of jade and gold, temples to honor the old gods who had been cast down by the Bloodstone Emperor, and walls thick enough to withstand any siege. He established a bureaucracy based on merit rather than birth, selecting the wisest scholars and the most capable administrators to help him rule his growing empire. But the Azure Emperor understood something that many conquerors do not. An empire is not merely territory on a map. An empire is culture, tradition, and shared identity. It is the belief of millions of people that they are part of something greater than themselves. To this end, the Azure Emperor and his successors did not simply impose their will on the conquered kingdoms. Instead, they wove together the disparate threads of Eastern culture into a new tapestry. They preserved the best of what had come before, the poetry and philosophy, the artistic traditions, the religious practices. They created a common written language that allowed scholars from one end of the empire to communicate with scholars from the other. They built roads and canals, connecting the cities and facilitating trade and communication. The religion they established drew heavily on the old faith of the great empire of the Dawn, but adapted it for a new age. They once again honored the Maiden-Made-of-Light and rejected the dark worship of the Bloodstone Emperor. They built temples where priests prayed for the prosperity of the empire and the wisdom of the emperor. They taught that the emperor ruled not by divine right, but by the mandate of heaven, and that this mandate could be withdrawn if the emperor failed in his duties to his people. This was a crucial innovation. Unlike the god emperors of old, who claimed to be divine themselves, the emperors of Yi Ti were acknowledged to be mortal men. They could be great or terrible, wise or foolish. Their legitimacy depended not on their blood alone, but on their actions. This created a system that was more flexible, more adaptable than what had come before, even as it maintained the stability and continuity that only an imperial system can provide. The geography of Yi Ti itself shaped its character and its destiny. The empire stretched along the coast of the Jade Sea, From the forested highlands in the west to the golden mountains in the south, to the north lay the dry grasslands and eventually the gray waste, a desolate expanse where few men ventured and fewer returned. To the east, beyond the great cities, lay the mysterious lands of Leng and the Shadowlands, places that even the bold merchants of Yi approached with caution. The Jade Sea was the lifeblood of the empire. Its waters teemed with fish and strange creatures that sailors would tell tales of in every port. Its shores gave rise to cities that would become legendary. Yin, the capital, with its golden towers and jade palaces. Tiki, where the greatest scholars gathered. Jinki, famed for its warriors and martial traditions, and further still, cities whose names are barely known in Westeros, but that rivaled anything the Valyrians would later build. The land itself was rich beyond measure. The valleys produced rice and millet in abundance, feeding millions. The forests yielded rare woods and precious resins. The mountains contained veins of gold, silver, and jade. The merchants of Yi would later say that their empire had been blessed by the Maiden-Made-of-Light herself, that she had looked upon the land and found it good, and had poured out her bounty upon it. But abundance alone does not make an empire. The Azure Emperor and his successors understood that they needed something more. They needed defenses against the threats that surrounded them, both human and otherwise. To the north, where the grasslands met the gray waste, they undertook a project of staggering ambition. They built the 5 forts, each one as large as a city, each one carved from a single piece of fused black stone. The purpose of these forts is a matter of debate among scholars. Some say they were built to defend against the nomadic horse lords of the Jogosnai, fierce raiders who swept down from the plains to pillage and burn. Others whisper of darker purposes, of things that lurked in the gray waste, things that the Lion of Night had left behind when the long night ended. Whatever their purpose, the 5 forts stood as a testament to the power and determination of Yitai's early rulers. They still stand today, thousands of years later, though who or what they defend against remains a mystery to most. As Yi grew in power and prosperity, it began to reach out beyond its borders. Merchants ventured forth along ancient trade routes, carrying silk and spices, jade and gold to distant lands. They sailed the Jade Sea and beyond, reaching Korth and even the free cities of Essos. Some claim that Yi-Ti's ships reached even further, that they found their way to the Summer Isles and beyond, though if this is true, the knowledge has been lost. These trade expeditions brought back more than just gold and goods. They brought back knowledge. The scholars of Yi learned of other civilizations, other ways of organizing society, other forms of government and religion. They studied and cataloged everything, adding it to the great libraries of Yin and Tiki. They became convinced that their empire represented the pinnacle of human achievement, the rightful center of the world, and everything else was merely peripheral. This was not entirely arrogance. In that age, before Valyria rose to dominate the Western world, Yitai was indeed the greatest civilization on Earth. Its cities were larger, its culture more refined, its learning more advanced. The crude stone castles of Westeros and the squabbling city-states of Essos must have seemed like children playing at civilization compared to the majesty of the Golden Empire. Yet even at the height of its early glory, there were signs of the challenges to come. The empire was vast, almost too vast to govern effectively. The distances between the capital and the outlying provinces were immense. Messages could take months to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Local governors, appointed by the emperor, sometimes began to act like kings in their own right, paying lip service to Yin, but ruling their territories as they saw fit. There were also the external threats. The Jogosnai continued their raids, and while they could not threaten the empire itself, they made life difficult for those who lived on the northern frontier. Pirates plagued the sea lanes, attacking merchant ships and sometimes even raiding coastal cities. And always there were whispers of things in the gray waste, of shadows moving where no shadows should be, of ruins from the age of the great empire of the dawn where dark things still dwelt. But these were manageable problems, the normal challenges that any great empire must face. For now, in this golden dawn of Yitai's history, the empire seemed invincible, eternal. The emperors sat upon their jade thrones and ruled over millions. The poets composed verses in their honor. The scholars recorded their deeds for posterity. The common people prospered and gave thanks to the Maiden-Made-of-Light for the peace and stability they enjoyed. They could not know, these early Yitis, that their empire would face trials that would shake it to its foundations. They could not foresee the civil wars that would tear it apart, the invasions that would threaten its very existence, the slow decline that would reduce the Golden Empire to a shadow of its former self. In this moment, in this golden dawn, anything seemed possible. The future stretched out before them, bright and limitless as the jade sea under the summer sun. But empires built by men are always temporary, always vulnerable. The seeds of future strife were already being sown, in the ambitions of princes, in the jealousies of noble houses, in the slow accumulation of grievances and contradictions that no system, however well designed, can entirely prevent. The golden dawn would give way to a golden age, and the golden age would give way to something darker, something harder. Yet none of this could diminish what had been achieved in these early centuries. From the chaos and ruin of the long night, from the ashes of the great empire of the dawn, the people of Yitai had built something magnificent, something worthy of memory. And though their empire would one day fall, as all empires must, the legacy of what they built would endure. The culture, the language, the traditions, the very idea of Yiti as the center of civilization, these would survive even the worst disasters that were to come. For an idea, once planted in the minds of millions, is harder to kill than any emperor, more enduring than any dynasty. This was the true achievement of the Azure Emperor and his successors. They created not just an empire of territory and wealth, but an empire of the mind and spirit. They gave their people an identity, a sense of purpose, a connection to something greater than themselves. And that, in the end, is what separates a true civilization from mere conquest and domination. If the founding of Yiti was its golden dawn, then the centuries that followed were its golden noon, when the sun stood highest in the sky and cast the least shadow. This was the Age of Azure, named for the dynasty that would guide the empires through its most prosperous years, when Yiti truly earned its title as the Golden Empire, when its influence stretched across the known world and its wealth seemed inexhaustible. The Azure emperors understood what their predecessors had begun, but not completed. An empire is not merely conquered, it must be continually renewed, its bonds strengthened, its purpose reaffirmed with each passing generation. Where lesser rulers might have been content to maintain what they had inherited, maintenant the Azure emperors sought always to expand, to improve, to perfect. They were builders and dreamers, warriors and scholars, all in equal measure. Under their rule, the city of Yin transformed from a regional capital into something that rivaled anything the world had ever seen. The imperial palace complex alone covered an area larger than many Westerosi castles, with buildings of jade and gold, courtyards that could hold 10,000 people, and gardens where rare flowers from every corner of the empire bloomed in carefully cultivated splendor. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a statement of power and permanence, a physical manifestation of the empire's glory. The streets of Yin were paved, with stones brought from quarries hundreds of miles away, fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. At night, lanterns of colored glass illuminated the main thoroughfares, casting everything in a warm, otherworldly glow. The wealthy lived in compounds with walls of painted brick and roofs of glazed tile that gleamed in the sunlight. Even the common people lived in relative comfort compared to the peasants of Westeros or the slaves of the eastern cities that would later rise to challenge Yitai's dominance. But Yin was only the crown jewel in a diadem of cities that stretched across the empire. To speak of Yiti's golden age is to speak of urban centers that each had their own character, their own contributions to the empire's greatness. Tiki, second only to Yin in size and prestige, became known as the City of Scholars. Here, the greatest minds of the age gathered to study the stars, to debate philosophy, to preserve and expand human knowledge. The libraries of Tiki were said to contain over 100,000 scrolls and books, covering every subject from agriculture to the movements of the heavenly bodies. Masters of various disciplines established schools, and students traveled from across the empire and beyond to learn from them. The scholars of Tiki were the ones who refined the written language, standardized measurements and calculations, and created the bureaucratic examinations that would determine who would govern the empire. Jinki in the Western Highlands was the martial heart of Yi Ti. Here, the sons of nobles learned the arts of war, not through crude hacking with swords as the knights of Westeros practiced, but through disciplined study of strategy, tactics, and the coordination of large armies. The generals of Jinki developed military innovations that would be studied for centuries: the use of coordinated infantry formations, the integration of cavalry and foot soldiers, the deployment of siege weapons with mathematical precision. When Yi Ti's armies marched, they did so with a discipline and organization that few enemies could match. Further along the coast, the city of Trader Town, as it was known in the common tongue, became the commercial hub of the empire. Here, merchants from Korth and the free cities mingled with Yi Ti's traders, exchanging goods from every corner of the known world: silk and spices, jade and precious stones, rare woods and metals, all passed through Trader Town's markets. The merchant princes who controlled this trade became wealthy beyond measure, though they were careful to show proper deference to the emperor and his representatives. They understood that their prosperity depended on the empire's stability and the protection its navy provided to the sea lanes. And then there was the city of winged men, perhaps the most mysterious of Yi Ti's great urban centers. The name itself sparks debate among those who study the histories. Did winged men truly dwell there in ages past? Were they survivors of some ancient race, remnants of the days before the long night? Or is the name merely poetic, referring to something else entirely, perhaps priests or sorcerers who claimed the ability to transcend the mortal realm? The records are unclear, deliberately so perhaps as if the emperors of Yi Ti wished to preserve certain mysteries even from their own chroniclers. What is certain is that the city of winged men was a center of arts and culture, where the most skilled poets composed verses that could move emperors to tears, where musicians played instruments unknown in the West, creating harmonies of breathtaking complexity. The paintings created there were prized across the empire, hanging in temples and palaces, depicting scenes from mythology and history with colors that seemed to glow with inner light. The cultural achievements of Yi Ti during this golden age extended far beyond a single city. The empire developed a sophisticated system of theatrical performance, with actors trained from childhood to embody characters from history and legend. These performances were not mere entertainment. They were moral instruction, ways of transmitting the values and lessons of the past to new generations. A play might depict the fall of the Bloodstone Emperor, showing the consequences of violating the natural order. Another might celebrate the wisdom of the Azure Emperor, demonstrating the virtues of patience, strategy, and benevolence in leadership. Poetry became the mark of an educated person. To be unable to compose verse, or at least to appreciate it, marked one as uncultured, unworthy of holding any position of authority. The greatest poets were honored by the emperor himself, their works preserved in the imperial libraries and taught to students throughout the empire. These poems dealt with themes that transcended their time and place: the passage of seasons as a metaphor for the rise and fall of dynasties, the loneliness of power, the beauty of nature as a reflection of cosmic order, the bittersweet nature of human existence. Philosophy flourished as well. The scholars of Yi Ti debated questions of governance and ethics, developing schools of thought that influenced how the empire was administered. Some argued for strict adherence to tradition and ritual, believing that social harmony depended on everyone knowing their place and fulfilling their duties. Others advocated for a more flexible approach, arguing that wise rulers must adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. These were not abstract debates. They had real consequences for how laws were written, how officials were selected, how justice was administered. The religious life of Yi during this period was characterized by a return to what the chroniclers called the pure faith, the worship of the Maiden-Made-of-Light, and the rejection of the dark practices associated with the Bloodstone Emperor. Temples were built in every major city, staffed by priests who performed daily rituals to ensure the continued prosperity of the empire and the favor of heaven. These priests were not merely religious figures, they were also scholars and advisors, often serving as moral authorities who could speak truth to power when the emperor or his officials strayed from the path of righteousness. Yet for all its focus on light and order, Yi-Ti's religion acknowledged the existence of darkness and chaos. The Lion of Night was not worshipped, but neither was he forgotten. Priests taught that eternal vigilance was necessary to prevent his return, that the proper performance of rituals and the maintenance of moral order were essential barriers against the darkness that always threatened to overwhelm the world. This created a culture that valued stability and tradition, that looked with suspicion on radical change, or innovations that might upset the delicate balance between light and dark, order and chaos. The economic foundation of Yi-Ti's golden age rested on several pillars. Agriculture was the base, with the fertile valleys producing enough surplus to feed the cities and allow for population growth. The empire's farmers were not the serfs of Westeros, bound to the land and their lords. Rather, they were subjects of the emperor, protected by law, able to appeal to imperial magistrates if local officials abused them. This created a more stable rural population, less likely to revolt, more invested in the empire's success. Trade was the second pillar. Yi-Ti's location on the Jade Sea made it a natural hub for commerce between the various peoples and kingdoms of the East. The imperial navy protected merchant vessels from pirates, and the empire's roads and canals facilitated the movement of goods overland. Tariffs and taxes on trade filled the imperial treasury, providing the resources needed to maintain the army, build public works, and support the bureaucracy. The third pillar was manufacturing. Yi-Ti's artisans were renowned throughout the known world. Their silk was softer and more lustrous than any other, woven with techniques that were closely guarded secrets. Their porcelain was so fine that it seemed to glow from within, decorated with intricate patterns that required years of training to master. Their jade carving produced objects of such beauty that owning one became a status symbol among the wealthy across the known world. These luxury goods commanded premium prices in foreign markets, bringing gold and silver flowing into Yi-Ti's coffers. But perhaps the empire's greatest achievement during this golden age was its bureaucracy. The Azure emperors and their successors developed a system of governance that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Officials were selected through competitive examinations that tested knowledge of history, philosophy, law, and administration. This meant that positions were filled, at least in theory, based on merit rather than birth. A farmer's son who studied diligently could rise to high office, while a nobleman's son who was lazy or incompetent would fail the examinations and be denied entry to the imperial service. This system had several advantages. It created a class of professional administrators who were loyal to the empire and the emperor rather than to local lords or their own families. It ensured that those who governed had at least basic competence at the tasks they would be performing. And it provided a path for social mobility that helped to maintain stability by giving talented individuals from lower classes a stake in the existing order. The bureaucracy itself was divided into various ministries, each responsible for different aspects of governance. The Ministry of Revenue collected taxes and managed the imperial treasury. The Ministry of Rites oversaw religious ceremonies and diplomatic protocols. The Ministry of War coordinated the empire's military forces. The Ministry of Works supervised public construction projects. The Ministry of Justice administered the legal system. Each ministry had its own hierarchy of officials, from the minister who reported directly to the emperor down to the lowest clerks who maintained records and carried out routine tasks. This administrative structure allowed Yi-Ti to govern an empire of unprecedented size and complexity. Orders from the capital could be transmitted through official channels to the most distant provinces. Tax revenues could be collected efficiently and accounted for. Justice could be administered with at least some degree of consistency across the empire. Public works could be coordinated on a massive scale. The construction of the 5 forts, which had begun in the empire's early days, was completed during this golden age. These massive structures, each built from fused black stone and rising hundreds of feet into the air, stretched across the northern frontier. The official explanation was that they defended against the Jogos Nai and other nomadic raiders. But there were always whispers, always legends, suggesting a darker purpose. The maesters of the citadel, when they write of the 5 forts at all, dismiss them as primitive fortifications, interesting only as examples of early engineering. But those who have actually seen the 5 forts tell a different story. They speak of stones so perfectly fitted that no blade can be slipped between them, of a black material unlike any other stone, of a scale of construction that seems impossible without powerful magic. They speak of the carvings that decorate some of the stones, depicting creatures that do not match any known animal, scenes of battles against enemies that are never fully shown, always lurking at the edges of the image. What were the Yetis defending against when they built these forts? What did they fear so much that they devoted generations of labor and unimaginable resources to creating this barrier? The official histories speak only of horse lords and raiders, but the legends, the songs, the stories whispered in the dark, these speak of something else. They speak of the gray waste and what lies beyond it. They speak of the Lion of Night and the possibility of his return. They speak of things that survive the long night and still lurk in the desolate places of the world, waiting for their moment to emerge once more. During Hitai's golden age, the 5 forts were well garrisoned, maintained by rotating contingents of the empire's best troops. Supplies flowed north to provision them. The soldiers who served there were honored upon their return to civilization, treated as heroes who held back the darkness. But even then, even at the height of the empire's power, there were reports of strange happenings along the northern frontier. Scouts who ventured beyond the forts and never returned. Sounds heard in the night that no animal could make. Shadows that moved against the wind. Ruins discovered in the gray waste that predated even the great empire of the dawn, built by hands that were not human. The Azure emperors took these reports seriously. They ensured the forts remained strong and well manned. They sent scholars to investigate the ruins, to try to learn more about what had come before. Some of what they discovered was added to the imperial archives. Much of it was deemed too disturbing, too dangerous, and was locked away or destroyed. The emperors understood that there were some forms of knowledge that could corrupt, some truths that were better left unknown. Yet for all these shadows at the edges, for all the hints of dangers beyond the empire's borders, this was truly a golden age. The common people prospered as never before. The arts and sciences flourished. The empire's power and prestige reached heights that would never be matched again. When merchants from Yiti arrived in Qarth or the Free Cities, they were treated with respect bordering on reverence. When scholars from other lands came to study in Tiki or Yin, they were humbled by the depth of knowledge they encountered. Even Valyria, rising to prominence in the West with its dragons and its sorcery, acknowledged Yiti as a peer rather than a subject. There were exchanges of embassies, carefully worded treaties that established spheres of influence, agreements on trade routes and tariffs. Neither empire wished to test the other in open conflict. Both were secure enough in their own power that they could afford to be diplomatic. The Yetis, who lived through this golden age, believed it would last forever. They could not imagine their empire falling, could not conceive of a time when Yin's golden towers might crumble, when the great cities might empty, when the bureaucracy might fail, and the armies dissolve. They had built something that seemed eternal, had created an order that appeared unshakable. They were wrong, of course. They had to be. Nothing lasts forever, least of all human institutions. The very success of the Golden Age contained within it the seeds of future decline. The wealth bred complacency. The stability bred factionalism. The size of the empire made it difficult to govern. The sophistication of the bureaucracy created layers of corruption and inefficiency. The military victories made the army overconfident. The cultural achievements made the empire insular, convinced of its own superiority, unwilling to learn from others or adapt to changing circumstances. But these problems were still in the future, barely visible on the horizon. For now, in this moment of golden splendor, Yitai stood as the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Its emperors ruled with wisdom and power. Its cities gleamed with gold and jade. Its people prospered and praised the Maiden-Made-of-Light for the blessings they enjoyed. The sun stood high in the sky, and none could imagine that it would ever set. Yet empires built on gold are tested by iron, and Yiti's trials were only beginning. The golden age could not last forever. The shadows gathering at the edges would eventually move toward the center. The internal contradictions would eventually demand resolution. The external threats would eventually grow too powerful to ignore. But all of that was yet to come. For now, there was only glory, only pride, only the certainty that Yi was the center of the world and would remain so for all time. They would learn differently. But that is a story for another chapter. Of all the mysteries surrounding Yitai, none captivates the imagination quite like the question of dragons. In Westeros, dragons are synonymous with House Targaryen and the dragon lords of old Valyria. The Meisters of the Citadel speak with certainty about the origins of these beasts, tracing them to the 14 Flames and the blood magic of the Valyrian freehold. Yet, in the ancient texts of Yi, in scrolls that predate Valyria's rise by thousands of years, there are references to dragons that suggest a far older, far stranger history. To understand this mystery, we must return once more to the age of the great Empire of the Dawn, to that primordial civilization that preceded Yitai by countless centuries. Among the fragmentary records that survive from that distant age, there are descriptions of creatures that can only be dragons, not metaphors, not legends mistaken for history. Detailed accounts of great winged reptiles that breathed fire and could be ridden by men. The ancient texts speak of the dragon emperors, rulers who supposedly commanded these beasts. According to these records, dragons were not merely weapons of war or symbols of power. They were integral to the spiritual and political order of the empire. The ability to bond with a dragon was seen as proof of divine favor, evidence that the emperor possessed the mandate of heaven. When an emperor died, his dragon would supposedly keen and wail, sometimes refusing food until it too perished, testament to a bond that transcended mere training or domination. The descriptions of these eastern dragons are both familiar and strange to anyone versed in the history of Valyrian dragons. They were said to be winged, fire-breathing creatures of immense size and power. They could devastate armies and reduce cities to ash, but there are differences in the accounts as well. The eastern dragons were supposedly more serpentine in form, longer and more sinuous than their Valyrian cousins. Some texts describe them as having the ability to speak, though whether this was literal speech or some form of telepathic communication is unclear. There are references to dragons of colors that were never seen in Valyria, jade-green dragons that supposedly brought fortune, golden dragons that heralded prosperity, and most ominously, shadow dragons of deepest black that were said to be omens of disaster. But here we must pause and acknowledge what we do not know, what cannot be confirmed through reliable sources. The Meisters would dismiss these accounts entirely, calling them nothing more than myths and legends, the fantasies of primitive peoples who saw dragons in the shapes of clouds, or explain natural phenomena through supernatural means. And they may be right. The records from the great empire of the dawn are fragmentary at best, passed down through countless generations, translated and retranslated, embellished and edited by scribes with their own agendas. Yet there are details in these accounts that give one pause. The descriptions are too specific, too technical in places, to be dismissed as pure invention. They speak of dragon breeding programs, of careful selection for certain traits, of the proper care and feeding of dragons. They discuss the perils of dragon riding, the particular saddles and harnesses used, the signals employed to direct a dragon in flight. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of practical knowledge, of actual experience. Some scholars, both in Yitai and in the West, have proposed theories to explain this apparent contradiction. Perhaps they suggest dragons did exist in the East in ancient times, but were driven to extinction long before Valyria rose. Perhaps the Valyrians discovered the last surviving dragons in some remote corner of the world and developed the magic to control and breed them. Perhaps the knowledge of dragons passed from east to west along ancient trade routes, and the Valyrians simply perfected what others had begun. There is another theory, more controversial, more disturbing in its implications. Some claim that dragons did not originate in any one place, that they are older than human civilization itself, that they have existed in various forms across the world since time immemorial. According to this view, the question is not where dragons came from, but rather why they disappeared from most of the world, surviving only in Valyria until the Doom. The answer these theorists propose centers on magic. They argue that dragons are fundamentally magical creatures, that they cannot exist in the absence of ambient magical energy. When magic was stronger in the world, during the age of the great empire of the dawn and the long night, dragons could thrive anywhere. As magic faded, as the world became more mundane, dragons could only survive in places where magical forces remained strong. Valyria, with its 14 flames and its blood sorcery, provided such an environment, but in most of the world, including Yi Ti, the magic dwindled and the dragons died with it. This theory finds some support in the timing of dragon disappearance from Eastern records. The last reliable accounts of dragons in Yi Ti date to the centuries immediately following the Long Night, during the chaotic period before the Azure Emperor unified the scattered kingdoms. After that, references to dragons become increasingly mythological rather than historical. They appear in art and literature, but always as symbols of an ancient past, never as living creatures that anyone has actually seen. By the time Yi Ti entered its golden age, dragons had become legend. The emperors no longer rode them into battle. The great dragon pens and breeding grounds had long since been abandoned, reclaimed by jungle and time. When the Valyrians emerged with their dragons, the Yi Ti's treated them with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Here were creatures thought lost forever, commanded by a civilization that was young by Eastern standards, upstarts wielding power that properly belonged to an older, greater age. Yet there is one account from Yi Ti's golden age that deserves particular attention, for it hints at connections that scholars are only beginning to explore. In the archives of Tiki, there is a scroll purportedly written by a scholar who traveled to Ashai and beyond, to the shadow lands that lie at the edge of the known world. This scholar claimed to have found ruins there that predated anything in Yi Ti or Valyria, structures built from the same fused black stone as the 5 forts, decorated with carvings of dragons and other creatures. According to this account, the scholar spoke with shadowbinders and other practitioners of the dark arts who dwelt in Ashai. They told him that dragons were not natural creatures but had been created through blood magic in ages past, that they were the product of sorcerers attempting to give physical form to the destructive power of fire itself. These shadowbinders claimed that the knowledge of how to create and control dragons had been preserved in Ashai since ancient times, but that few had the strength or the will to attempt the necessary rituals. The scholar's account goes on to suggest that the dragon lords of Valyria learned their art from Ashai, that they took ancient knowledge and refined it, making it more reliable and reproducible. This would explain why Valyrian dragons seemed more uniform than the varied descriptions of dragons in older Eastern texts. The Valyrians had not simply found dragons, they had learned to create them, according to specific parameters, to breed them for particular characteristics, to bind them to specific bloodlines through sorcery. But here we are venturing deep into speculation, into theories that cannot be proven or disproven with the evidence available to us. The masters would warn against such speculation, would insist on limiting our claims to what can be verified through multiple reliable sources, and they would be right to do so. Yet the questions remain, tantalizing and unanswerable. Did dragons truly fly over Yitai in ages past? If so, why did they vanish? What connection, if any, exists between the dragons of the great empire of the dawn and the dragons of Valyria? There is another theory that has gained currency in recent years among those who study the hidden histories of the world. This theory concerns the great empire of the Dawn itself and its possible connection to House Targaryen. The proponents of this theory point to several suggestive facts. First, the Targaryens are known to have distinct features: purple eyes and silver gold hair. These are unusual traits, rare even among the Valyrian dragon lords from whom the Targaryens descended. Second, the royal family of the great Empire of the Dawn was also said to have possessed unusual features, though the exact descriptions vary in different accounts. Some versions of the ancient texts describe the god emperors as having eyes like amethysts and hair that shone like pearls. Others speak of golden eyes and hair the color of moonlight. The descriptions are inconsistent, perhaps corrupted by time and translation, but they all agree that the imperial family looked different from ordinary people, that their distinctive appearance was a sign of their divine nature. Could there be a connection? Could the Targaryens, and by extension the other dragon lords of Valyria, be descended from the scattered remnants of the great empire of the Dawn? Could they carry in their blood some fraction of the power that the god emperors once wielded? The theory becomes even more intriguing when we consider the Bloodstone Emperor, the usurper whose crimes supposedly brought about the Long Night. According to Yi legend, the Bloodstone Emperor practiced dark sorcery and blood magic. He raised up a black stone that had fallen from the sky and worshipped it as a god. He sought power through forbidden means, violating the natural order in his ambition. Is it possible that the blood magic of old Valyria, the sorcery that allowed the dragon lords to control their beasts and maintain their power, originated with the Bloodstone Emperor? That the knowledge he developed, twisted and dark as it was, somehow survived the collapse of his empire and eventually made its way to Valyria? That the Targaryens and the other dragon lord families are the inheritors, however distant, of the Bloodstone Emperor's legacy? These are dangerous questions, the kind that can get a scholar expelled from the Citadel, or worse. They challenge fundamental assumptions about the origins of House Targaryen and the nature of Valyrian power. They suggest that the blood magic of the Dragon Lords was not a Valyrian innovation, but something far older, far darker, rooted in the greatest crime ever committed against the cosmic order. Yet we must be clear. These are theories, speculations built on fragmentary evidence and suggestive coincidences. There is no proof that the Targaryens descend from the great empire of the Dawn. There is no confirmed connection between the Bloodstone Emperor and Valyrian sorcery. The similarities could be nothing more than that: similarities, parallels between different cultures that developed independently of each other. What we can say with more certainty is that dragons, whether they truly existed in ancient Yitai or not, have been absent from the East for thousands of years. When the Targaryen dynasty fell in Westeros and their dragons died, the East took no notice. Dragons had already passed out of living memory in Yi long before. They belonged to the realm of legend and art, not to the world of politics and war. Yet the fascination with dragons never entirely disappeared from Yitai culture. They appear throughout the Empire's art and literature, always as symbols of power, wisdom, and divine favor. Emperors would sometimes style themselves as having the spirit of a dragon, claiming a metaphorical connection to the beasts even though no literal dragons existed to validate that claim. The greatest heroes of Yi legend were often described as dragon-like in their courage and terrible in their wrath. And in the temples and the archives, the old knowledge was preserved. The ancient texts that spoke of dragons and their riders were copied and recopied by generations of scribes, even though no one alive had ever seen a dragon. The breeding records and training manuals were maintained, though they described practices that no one had performed for millennia. It was as if Yi could not quite let go of its dragon past, could not fully accept that these magnificent creatures would never return. Some whisper that this preservation was not merely sentimental. They claim that certain emperors and their court sorcerers believed that dragons might one day return, that the conditions that had driven them away might reverse. that Yi Ti needed to preserve the knowledge so that when that day came, the Empire would be ready to reclaim its birthright. Whether such hopes were realistic or merely desperate fantasy, we cannot say. What is certain is that dragons did eventually return to the world, not in Yi Ti, but in Westeros, born from the funeral pyre of Khal Drogo and the will of Daenerys Targaryen. News of this event eventually reached the east, carried by merchants and travelers. The reaction in Yi Ti is said to have been mixed. Some saw it as a sign that the age of magic was returning, that the old powers were stirring once more. Others viewed it with trepidation, remembering the legends of the Long Night and the disasters that followed when the natural order was disrupted. But by that time, Yi Ti was already in decline, already struggling with internal strife and external threats. The return of dragons in distant Westeros was a marvel, a wonder, but it had little practical impact on the Empire's fortunes. The knowledge of dragon riding that had been so carefully preserved turned out to be useless, for the dragons were thousands of miles away and bonded to someone else, someone with no connection to Yi Ti or its imperial family. And so the mystery remains. Did dragons truly fly over the golden cities of Yi Ti in ages past? Were they created through ancient sorcery, or did they evolve naturally? What connection, if any, exists between the dragons of East and West? Why did they vanish from Yi Ti while surviving in Valyria? These questions may never be fully answered. The evidence is too fragmentary, too corrupted by time and agenda. The Maesters dismiss the Eastern accounts as unreliable. The scholars of Yi Ti insist on the historical reality of their empire's dragons, but cannot provide the kind of proof that would satisfy a skeptical mind. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in a past that was stranger and more complex than either extreme allows. Perhaps dragons did exist across the world in ancient times. Perhaps they were connected to magic in ways we do not fully understand. Perhaps they vanished as magic faded. And perhaps they have returned because magic itself is returning. Or perhaps the whole thing is elaborate mythology, stories told to glorify an empire's past and connected to forces greater than mere human achievement. What cannot be disputed is the impact these legends have had on Yi Ti's culture and self-conception. The idea that the empire once commanded dragons, that its emperors rode them into battle and used them to enforce their will, has become central to how Yi Ti sees itself. It is a golden age not merely of prosperity and culture, but of supernatural power, of magic made manifest. It represents a peak from which the empire has fallen, a greatness that may never be reclaimed. And in that sense, whether the dragons were real or imagined almost doesn't matter. They serve their purpose as symbols, as reminders of what was and what might be again. They inspire and they warn. They represent both the glory of Yi Ti's past and the hubris that perhaps contributed to its fall. For if the Bloodstone Emperor's crimes brought dragons and then disaster, what does that say about the pursuit of such power? What does it mean for those who would seek to reclaim it? These are questions that Yi Ti has wrestled with for thousands of years, questions that remain relevant even in the Empire's diminished present. The dragons are gone, perhaps forever. The age of magic, if it ever truly existed, has passed, but the legends endure, and with them the questions that cannot be answered, but also cannot be ignored. This is the paradox at the heart of Yi Ti's dragon legacy, a past that is both too important to forget and too distant to fully understand. Every golden age must end. Every empire, no matter how mighty, must eventually face the moment when its unity fractures and its strength turns inward upon itself. For Yi Ti, this moment came not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow unraveling, a gradual descent from glory into chaos that would span centuries and leave scars that never fully healed. These were the bleeding years, when the Golden Empire tore itself apart and the streets of its great cities ran red with the blood of those who fought over the scraps of what had once been whole. The seeds of this destruction were sown during the Golden Age itself, in the very success that had made Yi Ti great. The Azure dynasty, which had ruled with wisdom and strength for generations, had established a principle that would ultimately prove fatal. Succession based on merit and the mandate of heaven rather than simple primogeniture. In theory, this meant that the best candidate would always become emperor, ensuring competent leadership. In practice, it meant that ambitious princes and their supporters could always find justification for challenging the established order. The first cracks appeared subtly, almost invisibly to those who lived through them. An emperor would die, and instead of one clear successor, there would be 2 or 3 candidates, each with some claim to legitimacy. Brothers would compete against brothers, uncles against nephews. The imperial court would divide into factions, each backing their chosen candidate. The bureaucracy, which had been the empire's strength, became a battleground where officials maneuvered for advantage and plotted against their rivals. Initially, these succession crises were resolved relatively peacefully. The candidate with the strongest backing would ascend to the throne, and the losers would accept their fate, perhaps retiring to the countryside, or taking up positions in the imperial bureaucracy. But with each succession, the process became more contentious, more violent. Losers stopped accepting defeat gracefully. Winners stopped showing mercy to their defeated rivals. What had begun as political maneuvering evolved into something darker and more destructive. The breaking point came during the succession crisis that followed the death of the emperor, known to history as the Wise Dragon. He had ruled for 40 years, presiding over what many thought would be an eternal peace and prosperity. He had 3 sons, each capable, each with supporters among the nobility and the bureaucracy. When the Wise Dragon died, he left no clear designation of his heir, perhaps believing that his sons would work together for the good of the empire, perhaps simply unable to choose among them. They did not work together. The eldest son, who bore the title of Crown Prince and believed succession was his by right, claimed the throne immediately. The second son, who had served as governor of the wealthy southern provinces and commanded the loyalty of the empire's most prosperous region, declared that his elder brother was unfit to rule. The youngest son, who had spent years at the northern frontier commanding the armies that defended the 5 forts, marched his troops south and announced that heaven had chosen him to restore proper order to the empire. Thus began the War of the 3 Princes, the first true civil war to ravage Et, since the Azure Emperor had unified the scattered kingdoms so many centuries before. For 10 years, the 3 brothers and their supporters fought across the length and breadth of the empire. Armies that had been created to defend against external enemies now turned their weapons on each other. Cities that had known only peace for generations found themselves besieged by rival claimants. The bureaucracy ceased to function as officials pledged loyalty to different sides. Trade collapsed as merchants feared to venture onto roads where armies might seize their goods. Farmers abandoned their fields as soldiers from all sides demanded provisions and pressed men into service. The war was brutal and indecisive. None of the 3 brothers could gain a decisive advantage. The eldest held the capital and the symbolic legitimacy that came with it. The second commanded the wealthiest provinces and could afford to hire mercenaries from across the known world. The youngest had the loyalty of the battle-hardened northern armies. They fought each other to exhaustion, and in the end, none of them lived to see the throne secure. The eldest died of disease in the 6th year of the war, his body weakened by the stress of continuous campaigning. The second was assassinated by one of his own generals who had been secretly bribed by the youngest. The youngest survived the longest, but he was killed in battle during the war's final year, leading a desperate charge against a coalition of nobles who had decided they wanted none of the 3 brothers on the throne. When the dust finally settled, it was not one of the princes who wore the imperial crown, but a distant cousin, a minor member of the royal family who had stayed neutral throughout the conflict. He ascended the throne not through victory, but through exhaustion. The empire simply had no more strength to continue fighting. The various factions agreed to support him, not because they believed in him, but because they could not agree on anyone else and feared that further conflict would destroy what little remained of Yeti's greatness. This new emperor tried to restore what had been lost. He rebuilt the bureaucracy, reopened trade routes, encouraged farmers to return to their fields. But he could not undo what had been done. The empire had been fundamentally weakened. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Yeti was shattered. The idea that the mandate of heaven ensured stable succession had been revealed as hollow. Worst of all, the precedent had been set. Succession disputes could and would be resolved through violence, and so they were. The War of the Three Princes was only the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, Yi Ti would endure no fewer than 7 major civil wars and countless smaller rebellions and uprisings. Each conflict followed a similar pattern. An emperor would die, multiple claimants would emerge, the empire would fracture along regional or factional lines, armies would march, cities would burn, and eventually some form of resolution would be reached, though never a permanent one. The Scarlet Emperors emerged from one of these conflicts, establishing a new dynasty that claimed descent from the original Azure line, but through a different branch of the family. They took their name from the color they adopted as their standard, blood red, a grimly appropriate choice given the violence through which they had gained power. The Scarlet Emperors ruled with an iron fist, believing that only harsh discipline could hold the empire together. They expanded the secret police, encouraged officials to spy on each other, and dealt ruthlessly with any hint of dissent. For a time, this approach worked. The empire enjoyed a period of relative stability under Scarlet rule, but stability bought through fear and repression is always fragile. The Scarlet Emperors made enemies faster than they could eliminate them. They alienated the scholarly class with their anti-intellectual suspicion of education. They antagonized the merchant princes with heavy taxation and arbitrary seizures of property. They enraged the common people with brutal enforcement of laws and conscription for endless military campaigns designed to overawe potential rebels. In the end, the Scarlet Dynasty fell not to external invasion, but to a palace coup. The emperor known to history as the Bloody Scarlet, whose cruelty had become legendary even by the standards of his house, was murdered in his bed by his own guards. The commander of these guards then seized the throne, declaring himself the first Orange Emperor and promising a return to the wisdom and benevolence of the ancient Azure dynasty. The Orange Emperors proved marginally better than the Scarlet, but they faced the same fundamental problem. The empire was too large, too diverse, too divided by centuries of civil war to be easily governed. Regional governors who had been forced to raise their own armies to defend against rebels or rival claimants became de facto independent rulers, paying lip service to the emperor in Yin, but acting as kings in their own territories. Noble families that had once competed for positions in the imperial bureaucracy now competed for control of entire provinces. The great cities that had been Yi Ti's pride began to decline. Yin still stood, its golden towers still gleamed in the sunlight, but the population had shrunk. Whole districts stood empty, too expensive to maintain, too dangerous to inhabit. The imperial palace, which had once housed 10,000 servants and officials, now echoed with emptiness. The libraries of Tiki were neglected, their collections scattered or destroyed in successive waves of violence. Jinki, the martial heart of the empire, saw its military academies close, as generals preferred to train their own troops in their own territories, rather than sending sons to a central institution. Trade, which had been the lifeblood of Yi Ti's prosperity, withered. Merchants could no longer rely on the imperial navy to protect the sea lanes from pirates. The roads were unsafe, bandits and deserters preying on travelers. The canals fell into disrepair, their locks broken, their channels silted up. Goods that once flowed freely throughout the empire now moved in fits and starts, if they moved at all. The merchant princes, who had grown wealthy during the Golden Age, either fled to other lands or retreated to fortified compounds, hoarding their wealth against an uncertain future. The common people suffered most. They had no fortified compounds to retreat to, no private armies to protect them. They endured the passage of armies that seized their crops and livestock, conscription by rival warlords, taxation by whatever authority happened to control their region at any given moment. The stability that had allowed them to prosper, to raise families in relative peace, to believe in a better future for their children, all of this vanished. Life became brutish and precarious. Many abandoned their homes, fleeing to the cities or to foreign lands, anywhere that might offer safety. The cultural impact was equally devastating. The great artistic traditions that had flourished during the Golden Age withered without patronage. Poets could not compose verses when they feared for their lives. Painters could not create when their cities burned. Philosophers could not debate when any idea might be deemed seditious by whatever warlord currently held power. The theatrical performances that had been moral instruction became propaganda, each regime using them to justify its own legitimacy and demonize its rivals. Even religion suffered. The temples to the Maiden-Made-of-Light, which had been centers of learning and moral authority, became targets during the civil wars. Rival factions accused the priests of supporting their enemies. Some priests did take sides, believing they had a duty to support the more legitimate or more virtuous claimant. This politicization of religion further undermined the empire's unity, as even the gods seemed to have chosen sides in the conflicts. The bureaucracy, which had been Yi Ti's administrative foundation, became a hollow shell. The examination system continued to function after a fashion, but the positions it filled were increasingly meaningless. Officials appointed by the central government often found that they had no actual authority in the provinces they were supposed to govern. Local warlords tolerated them as long as they didn't interfere, ignored them otherwise. The ministries in Yin still existed, still maintained their records and performed their rituals, but they governed only the capital and its immediate surroundings, not the vast empire they claimed to administer. Yet, throughout these bleeding years, despite the endless violence and decline, the idea of Yitai as a unified empire never quite died. Even the most ambitious warlords, even those who were effectively independent rulers of their own territories, maintained the fiction that they were loyal subjects of the emperor in Yin. They continued to use imperial dating systems in their official documents. They sent tribute to the capital, however token. They requested official titles and appointments, as if these still meant something. This persistence of the imperial ideal, even in the absence of imperial reality, is one of the great puzzles of Yi Ti's history. Why did no one simply declare the empire dead and establish independent kingdoms? Why did powerful generals and wealthy princes continue to pretend that an emperor in a distant capital had authority over them? The answer lies partly in culture and tradition. Yi Ti had been unified for so long that the idea of a divided East seemed unnatural, wrong. The memory of the Golden Age remained strong, even among those who had never experienced it. There was always the hope that a new Azure Emperor would arise, a new unifier who would restore what had been lost. To formally abandon the empire would be to abandon that hope, to admit that the Golden Age could never return. There was also a practical consideration. Claiming to be a loyal subject of the emperor, even a weak emperor, provided a form of legitimacy. It distinguished one from mere rebels and bandits. It allowed alliances and negotiations to be couched in terms of service to the empire rather than naked self-interest. And it kept open the possibility that one might oneself become emperor, might be the one to finally reunify the empire and establish a new dynasty. And so the charade continued. Weak emperors sat on the throne in Yin, issuing edicts that no one obeyed, appointing officials who had no power, maintaining a court that grew shabbier with each passing year. Meanwhile, the real power lay with the warlords and the governors, the generals and the merchant princes, each ruling their own territories, each maintaining their own armies, each watching their neighbors with suspicion and plotting against their rivals. The bleeding years transformed Yitai from a unified empire into a collection of competing states that merely pretended to be part of a greater whole. The Golden Age became a memory, then a legend, then a myth. The old men who claimed to remember it were dismissed as fabulists. How could such greatness ever have existed? How could the shabby, violent, chaotic present have emerged from anything so glorious? Yet the decline was not total. Even in the midst of civil war, even in the darkest moments of the bleeding years, pockets of civilization persisted. Some cities maintained their walls and their traditions. Some scholars continued their studies. Some artists created works of beauty amidst the ugliness. The human spirit, even in Yitai as everywhere else, proved remarkably resilient, remarkably unwilling to surrender entirely to despair, but the damage had been done. The empire had fallen from heights that would never be reached again. The unity had been shattered in ways that would never be fully repaired. The golden age was over, and everyone knew it, even if they could not quite bring themselves to say it aloud. Yi Ti had bled for centuries, and the wounds went too deep to heal. The empire survived, but it was a ghost of what it had once been, a shadow pretending to substance, a title without the reality of power. And the worst was still to come, for internal strife was not Yi Ti's only enemy. From beyond the 5 forts, ancient terrors were stirring, drawn perhaps by the scent of weakness, sensing that the great empire that had once held them at bay was no longer capable of defending itself. The bleeding years had weakened Yitai from within. What came next would threaten it from without, testing whether anything remained of the strength that had once made the Golden Empire the wonder of the world. While Yitai tore itself apart through generations of civil war, while emperor fought emperor and brother slaughtered brother, something else was happening along the empire's northern frontier. The 5 forts, those massive structures of fused black stone that had been built to defend against threats from beyond, began to report strange occurrences. Patrols ventured into the gray waste and did not return. Sounds echoed across the desolate plains that no natural creature could make. Shadows moved against the wind. The garrisons that had once been rotated regularly with fresh troops found themselves isolated, forgotten by an empire too consumed with its own internal struggles to remember its outer defenses. The soldiers who manned the 5 forts during these dark years left behind records, fragmentary and disturbing, that speak of their growing fear and isolation. They wrote of watching the gray waste from their towers, seeing lights in the distance that appeared and disappeared without explanation. They described winds that carried voices, though whether these were the cries of the dying or something else entirely, they could not say. They reported finding the remains of patrols that had vanished months earlier, but the bodies were wrong somehow, positioned in ways that suggested ritual rather than simple death, marked with symbols that no one recognized. The officers in command of the fort sent increasingly desperate messages to Yin, begging for reinforcements, for supplies, for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that the frontier still existed and still needed defending. But in a capital consumed with succession crises and factional conflicts, these pleas went largely unheeded. The 5 forts were distant. The threats they reported were vague and unverifiable, and there were more immediate concerns closer to home. To understand what the 5 forts were meant to defend against, we must venture into territory where history blurs into legend, where the reliable accounts of chroniclers give way to the whispered tales of those who claim to have seen things that should not exist. The maesters of the Citadel would warn us to tread carefully here, to distinguish between verified fact and unsubstantiated rumor. But in the case of the Grey Waste and what lies beyond, the line between fact and rumor has always been difficult to discern. The oldest texts from Yi Ti speak of the Lion of Night, a being of cosmic evil that supposedly ruled over an age of darkness. According to legend, the Lion of Night was defeated or sealed away at the end of the long night, when the sun returned and the world was saved from eternal darkness. But legends also say that the Lion of Night was not destroyed, merely imprisoned, and that he waits still in the desolate places of the world, biding his time, testing his bonds, seeking any weakness that might allow his return. Whether the Lion of Night is literal truth or metaphor for some other threat is a question that has occupied scholars for centuries. Some argue that the legend is simply the Yi Ti's version of the tales told in Westeros about the Others and the Long Night, that all human cultures have creation myths and apocalypse stories, and that these should not be taken as historical fact. Others point to the consistency of the accounts across different cultures and eras, suggesting that something did happen during the Long Night, something so traumatic that it was remembered in legend for thousands of years afterward. What is certain is that the Grey Waste has always been a place of dread. It is a vast expanse of ash and dust, where nothing grows and nothing lives, where the wind howls across empty plains and ancient ruins hint at civilizations that vanished long before the great empire of the dawn. Those few who have ventured into the gray waste and returned speak of an oppressive atmosphere, a sense of being watched, of malevolent presences lurking just beyond the edge of perception. They describe ruins built from the same black stone as the 5 forts, but older, more weathered, decorated with carvings that depict scenes of cosmic horror. Beyond the gray waste lie lands even more mysterious and terrible. The maps call one region the Cannibal Sands, and the name tells you everything you need to know about what travelers have reported from there. Another area is marked simply as Bone Town, supposedly the site of an ancient city that was destroyed so completely that only skeletons remained, piled in massive heaps that have never been properly explained. There are tales of a plain of petrified trees, each one twisted into shapes that suggest agony, as if the very wood screamed as it turned to stone. And then there are the stories, difficult to verify but persistent across centuries, of things that come down from these lands when the 5 forts are not properly guarded. The Yi-Ti'is have names for these entities, names that translate poorly into the common tongue, but that carry connotations of darkness, cold, and death. Some descriptions make them sound similar to the others of Westerosi legend, tall, gaunt figures that move with unnatural grace, that bring cold wherever they go, that kill with weapons that shatter steel like glass. Other accounts describe different creatures entirely, things that wear human skin but are not human, corpses that walk and hunger for the living, shadows that can detach from their sources and strike independently. Are these accounts reliable? The Maesters would say no, that they are the products of fear and superstition, that men stationed in isolated posts for long periods naturally develop paranoia and see threats where none exist. They would point out that no credible witness from outside Yi-Ti has ever confirmed these stories, that the evidence consists entirely of local legends and fragmentary reports from soldiers who had every reason to exaggerate dangers in order to secure more resources for their garrisons. Yet there are details in these accounts that give one pause: the consistency of certain descriptions across different eras and different sources, the specificity of some reports, which provide tactical details about how these creatures move and fight that seem too precise to be pure invention. The fact that similar legends exist in Westeros, far across the world, suggesting that perhaps these threats were not confined to any single region, but appeared wherever the long night touched. Some scholars have proposed a theory that attempts to reconcile these accounts with a more rational worldview. They suggest that during the chaos following the long night, groups of humans in the far north and east, cut off from civilization, degenerated into savagery. These tribes might have developed practices that seemed monstrous to civilized observers: cannibalism, human sacrifice, the preservation of corpses for religious purposes. Over time, as these tribes raided the frontiers of more settled lands, the memory of their atrocities became exaggerated and mythologized, transforming mere savage humans into supernatural monsters. This theory has the advantage of not requiring belief in magic or the supernatural. It explains the legends in terms that the Meisters can accept, but it has difficulty accounting for the scale of the threat described in some accounts, or for the specific details about cold and ice that appear repeatedly in the legends, or for the fact that the 5 forts seem deliberately designed to defend against something far more dangerous than human raiders, however savage. Regardless of what actually lurked beyond the gray waste, the neglect of the 5 forts during Itai's civil wars had consequences. The Hyogosnai, horse lords who had always raided the empire's northern frontier but had been kept in check by strong garrisons, grew bolder as the forts weakened. They came not in small bands but in vast hordes, tens of thousands of mounted warriors sweeping down from the plains. The Jogosnai were not supernatural monsters from legend. They were flesh and blood humans, skilled horsemen, and fierce warriors who lived by raiding and conquest. They had never been able to threaten Yi-Ti seriously when the empire was strong and unified, but now, with the empire fragmented and its northern armies either disbanded or called south to fight in civil wars, The Jogosnai saw opportunity. They struck with devastating effect. Towns and cities along the northern frontier that had stood for centuries fell to their attacks. The Jogosnai did not conquer in the traditional sense. They had no interest in occupying territory or establishing permanent settlements. Instead, they raided, taking everything of value and burning what remained. They carried off slaves by the thousands, both for their own use and to sell in the markets of other lands. They slaughtered those who resisted and those who could not be profitably enslaved. The provincial governors who nominally ruled the northern territories proved unable to mount an effective defense. Their forces were small, scattered, and demoralized. Many governors chose to abandon the frontier entirely, withdrawing to more defensible positions closer to the empire's heartland and leaving the rural population to fend for itself. This created a cascade of refugees, desperate people fleeing south, overwhelming the resources of cities that were already struggling under the strain of civil war. Some warlords saw opportunity in this crisis. They raised armies, claimed they were defending the empire against the foreign invaders, and used their military success against the Jogosnai to legitimize their own claims to power. One such warlord, who styled himself the Defender of the North, achieved notable victories against the Horse Lords and used his prestige to launch a bid for the imperial throne itself. He marched his armies south, declaring that only he had proven capable of protecting Yitai from its enemies, and that heaven had clearly withdrawn its mandate from the weak emperor in Yin. This created the bitter irony that has often characterized Yiti's decline. Success against external enemies led directly to renewed internal conflict. The Defender of the North's campaign against the capital weakened the empire's ability to resist further Jogosnai incursions. His armies, which might have continued defending the frontier, were instead diverted to besieging cities and fighting other Yitis. The Jogosnai, quick to take advantage of this distraction, launched new raids, penetrating deeper into imperial territory than ever before. The Ga'i pattern would repeat itself several times over the following decades. A warlord would rise, would achieve victories against external enemies, would then use those victories to justify a bid for supreme power, and in doing so would weaken the empire's overall defensive posture. Each cycle left Yiti more vulnerable, more fractured, less capable of coordinated response to external threats. The loss of territory during this period was staggering. Entire provinces that had been part of Yitai since the days of the Azure Emperor were effectively abandoned. The northern reaches, which had once been dotted with prosperous towns and farming villages, became a wasteland. The 5 forts themselves, those massive structures that had stood for thousands of years, were gradually abandoned as maintaining garrison in them became impossible. By the time the empire achieved some measure of internal stability, the damage had been done. The frontier had moved hundreds of miles south. Cities that had been deep within imperial territory now found themselves on the border, vulnerable to raids. The trade routes that had connected Yiti to other lands had been disrupted or destroyed entirely. The empire that had once stretched from the Jade Sea to the Grey Waste now controlled barely half that territory. But the Jogosnai were not the only external threat Yiti faced during this period of weakness. To the south and west, other powers were rising. Powers that had once been subordinate to Yiti, or had at least respected its strength. The city-states along the Jade Sea, which had formerly paid tribute and acknowledged Yitai's supremacy, now acted independently. Some even launched attacks on Yitai's coastal cities, seeing opportunity in the empire's distraction with internal conflicts. From across the seas came pirates and raiders of various origins. Some were opportunistic criminals taking advantage of the collapse of Yitai's naval power. Others were organized fleets backed by rival kingdoms, and city-states seeking to weaken Yitai further or to seize its trade routes. The Jade Sea, which had once been virtually a Yitai's lake, controlled absolutely by the Imperial Navy, became contested waters where merchant ships traveled at their peril. The economic consequences of these external threats compounded the damage already done by civil war. Trade, which had been a pillar of Yiti's prosperity, shrank to a fraction of its former volume. The luxury goods that had once flowed from Yiti to distant markets became rare and expensive as production declined and transport became dangerous. The gold and silver that had flowed into the empire from foreign trade dried up, leaving the imperial treasury empty and making it even harder to raise and maintain armies. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological impact. Yi Ti had defined itself for so long as the center of civilization, the great empire that all others looked to with awe and respect, to be raided by horse lords that the empire had once considered beneath notice, to lose control of seas that had been dominated for centuries, to see tribute states declaring independence and facing no consequences. All of this was devastating to Yi Ti's sense of itself. The scholars and poets of this era wrote extensively about the empire's humiliation, comparing it unfavorably to the Golden Age and searching for explanations for how such a mighty civilization could have fallen so far. Some blamed moral decay, arguing that Yi Ti had abandoned the virtues that made it great and was now reaping the consequences. Others pointed to failures of leadership, cataloging the mistakes of various emperors and generals. Still others saw the hand of cosmic forces at work, suggesting that the Maiden-Made-of-Light had withdrawn her favor, or that the Lion of Night was somehow reasserting his influence over the world. What none of them seemed willing to fully acknowledge was that the external threats were largely consequences of internal failures. The Jogosnai had always been there, had always posed some degree of danger, but they had never been able to seriously threaten Yi Ti when the empire was strong and united. The pirates and raiders had always existed, but they had been controllable when Yi Ti maintained a powerful navy. The tribute states had always harbored desires for independence, but they had remained loyal when Yi Ti could credibly threaten them with overwhelming force. It was the civil wars, the succession crises, the centuries of internal bleeding that had created the conditions for external enemies to prosper. Yi Ti had not been conquered from without. It had weakened itself from within, and then found that it lacked the strength to defend against threats that would have been manageable in other circumstances. Yet even in this darkest period, even as the empire shrank and external enemies pressed in from all sides, the core of Yi Ti survived. Yin still stood, its golden towers tarnished but not fallen. The central provinces, though diminished, retained some measure of civilization and order. The idea of Yi Ti, the cultural identity that bound the Yi Ti's together, proved more resilient than any particular dynasty or set of borders. And always, there were those who looked to the 5 forts and the gray waste beyond with particular dread. For beneath the immediate threats of horse lords and pirates, beneath the mundane dangers of human enemies seeking plunder or territory, there lurked the ancient fear, the cosmic terror that had haunted Yi Ti since the long night. Whatever lay beyond the gray waste, whether supernatural evil or merely the ruins of civilizations best left undisturbed, it represented a threat of a different order entirely. The Yi Ti's, who had abandoned the 5 forts, told themselves it was a practical decision, that they could not maintain garrisons in the far north when they needed every soldier to fight civil wars or defend the new frontier, but some whispered that it was a mistake of the gravest kind, that the forts had been built for a reason that transcended petty human conflicts, that by abandoning them, Yi Ti had left open a door that should have remained closed. Whether those whispers had any basis in truth, or whether they were merely the fears of a declining civilization looking for external explanations for its troubles, no one could say for certain. But as Yi Ti's golden age receded further into the past, as the empire continued its long, slow decline, the question lingered. What had the 5 forts been built to contain? And now that they stood empty and unmanned, what might be stirring in the gray wastes beyond? To understand Yi Ti fully, one must look beyond the battles and the emperors, beyond the rise and fall of dynasties and the movement of armies across maps. One must look into the realm of the spirit, into the beliefs and practices that shaped how the Yi Ti's understood their world and their place within it. For Yi Ti was not merely a political entity or an economic system. It was, at its heart, a civilization built on particular understandings of the divine, the magical, and the nature of reality itself. The religion of Yi Ti, as it existed during the Empire's height, was a complex tapestry woven from threads that stretched back to the great empire of the dawn and beyond. At its center stood two cosmic principles, locked in eternal opposition, yet also in eternal balance. The Maiden-Made-of-Light represented all that was good and life-giving: the sun, warmth, growth, order, civilization. She was not worshipped as a goddess in the way that Westerosi might worship the Seven or the old gods, but rather as a cosmic principle, a manifestation of the fundamental goodness woven into the fabric of existence. Opposed to her stood the Lion of Night, the embodiment of darkness, cold, death, chaos, and destruction. He, too, was not exactly a god in the conventional sense, but rather a force, an aspect of reality that could not be ignored or wished away. The Lion of Night represented everything that threatened civilization, everything that lurked beyond the light of campfires and the safety of city walls. He was the darkness between the stars, the cold of winter, the silence of the grave. The relationship between these two principles was understood differently by different schools of thought within Yi Ti. Some held that they were truly cosmic forces, independent entities that had existed before the world was made, and would exist after it ended. Others argued that they were merely ways of describing natural phenomena, that the Maiden-Made-of-Light was simply what primitive people called the sun and its effects, while the Lion of Night was their way of personifying darkness and danger. What is certain is that the worship of these principles shaped Yi Ti society in profound ways. The temples dedicated to the Maiden-Made-of-Light were not merely places of worship, but centers of learning and moral instruction. The priests who served these temples were scholars as much as holy men, versed in history and philosophy, astronomy and mathematics. They taught that right conduct, proper ritual, and the maintenance of social order were all ways of serving the Maiden-Made-of-Light and keeping the Lion of Night at bay. The daily rituals performed in these temples were elaborate affairs, precisely timed to the movements of the sun and stars. At dawn, priests would chant hymns welcoming the return of light. At noon, when the sun stood highest, they would give thanks for its warmth and life-giving power. At sunset, they would perform protective rituals, asking the Maiden-Made-of-Light to guard the world through the dangerous hours of night. These were not optional devotions but essential acts, believed to maintain the cosmic balance and prevent the triumph of darkness. The emperors themselves participated in these rituals, not as mere worshippers but as essential intermediaries between heaven and earth. The mandate of heaven, which justified imperial rule, was understood to be a relationship between the emperor and the cosmic principles. A good emperor, one who ruled justly and maintained proper order, helped the Maiden-Made-of-Light in her eternal struggle against the Lion of Night. A bad emperor, through his corruption and misrule, weakened the forces of light and gave strength to darkness. This belief had practical political consequences. When disaster struck, when crops failed, or barbarians invaded, it was seen as evidence that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, that cosmic forces were withdrawing their support from his rule. This provided ideological justification for rebellion and regime change, but it also placed enormous pressure on emperors to maintain at least the appearance of virtue and competence. Alongside this official state religion, there existed other practices and beliefs, some tolerated, some suppressed, all contributing to the rich spiritual landscape of Yi Ti. There were folk religions practiced by common people, involving local spirits and ancestor worship, rituals to ensure good harvests and protect against disease. There were mystery cults that promised secret knowledge and spiritual transformation to initiated members. And there were practices that the authorities regarded as dangerous heresies, dark worship that violated the natural order. The memory of the Bloodstone Emperor hung over all discussions of forbidden religion. According to legend, he had cast down the proper worship of the Maiden-Made-of-Light and raised up in its place a black stone that had fallen from the sky. What exactly this meant, what sort of worship the Bloodstone Emperor practiced, remained unclear in the surviving accounts. Some suggested it was a form of demon worship, calling upon entities from beyond the mortal realm. Others claimed it involved human sacrifice and blood magic, the use of death to fuel supernatural power. Still, others argued that the Bloodstone Emperor had discovered some cosmic truth, some fundamental knowledge about the nature of reality that was too dangerous for ordinary people to comprehend. Whatever the truth, the Bloodstone Emperor's religion was absolutely forbidden in Yitai. To be accused of practicing his dark arts was to invite immediate execution, often after torture designed to force confession and revelation of fellow practitioners. Yet whispers persisted that such practices continued in secret, passed down through hidden lineages, preserved in texts that were supposed to have been destroyed centuries ago. Then there was the question of magic itself, perhaps the most contentious subject in all of Yitai scholarship. Did magic exist? Had it once existed but faded from the world? Or were all accounts of magical phenomena merely superstition and trickery? During Yitai's golden age, there were individuals known as sorcerers or alchemists who claimed to possess supernatural powers. They served in the courts of emperors, advising on matters both mundane and mystical. They supposedly could predict the future through various forms of divination, reading omens in the stars, in the patterns of smoke from burning incense, in the way oil spread across water. They claimed to create elixirs that could extend life, cure diseases, or grant visions of distant places and times. The historical records are frustratingly vague about what these sorcerers actually accomplished. The court chronicles mention them frequently, but rarely provide specific, verifiable details of their abilities. A sorcerer might be credited with predicting a military victory or warning of an assassination plot, but the accounts never quite make clear whether this was genuine supernatural knowledge or simply shrewd political calculation disguised as magic. Some texts describe more dramatic feats. There are stories of sorcerers calling down lightning from clear skies, of creating illusions so convincing that armies fled in terror, of communing with spirits and demons to gain forbidden knowledge. But these accounts become more common and more elaborate the further back in time one goes, leading skeptics to argue that they are simply legends that accumulated over the centuries, each retelling adding new embellishments. The Meisters of the Citadel, predictably, dismiss all such claims as fraudulent. They argue that what the YTEs called magic was simply natural phenomena misunderstood, or clever tricks performed by charlatans, or legends created to glorify the past at the expense of historical accuracy. In their view, the sorcerers of YT were no different from the alleged wizards and witches found in every culture. Confidence artists who exploited people's credulity for their own benefit. Yet there are scholars, even in the West, who argue that magic was once real in YT and elsewhere, that it truly existed during the age of the great empire of the dawn and the long night, but that it has since faded from the world. They point to structures like the Five Forts, built from fused black stone, using techniques that no modern mason can replicate, as evidence of powers that have been lost. They cite the consistency of magical traditions across different cultures, separated by vast distances, suggesting a common experience of supernatural phenomena rather than independent invention of similar myths. Some proponents of this theory suggest that magic, like the dragons that supposedly once flew over Yitai, depended on conditions that no longer exist in the world. Perhaps there was once more ambient magical energy, some fundamental property of reality that has since changed or dissipated. In such an environment, certain individuals with the right training or inherent abilities could perform feats that would be impossible in the more mundane world that followed. Among the magical practices most associated with Yitai were those of the alchemists. These individuals occupied a middle ground between the mystical sorcerers and the practical scholars. They studied the properties of various substances, combining and transforming them according to complex procedures, seeking to unlock hidden powers or create materials with useful properties. Some of their work was clearly proto-chemistry, legitimate if primitive scientific investigation. But their ultimate goals often strayed into the realm of the impossible, creating gold from base metals, discovering an elixir of immortality, producing substances that could grant supernatural abilities to those who consumed them, The imperial library in Yin supposedly contained extensive alchemical texts accumulated over centuries of experimentation. What these texts actually contained, whether genuine knowledge or elaborate nonsense, became a subject of debate during Yitai's decline. As the empire weakened and foreign enemies pressed in, some desperate rulers turned to these old texts, hoping to find forgotten weapons or techniques that might restore Yiti's power. There are accounts of emperors funding elaborate alchemical experiments, seeking some miracle that would reverse their fortunes. None of these experiments appear to have succeeded, at least not in any dramatic way that changed the course of history. This could mean that the alchemical texts contained nothing of real value, or it could mean that the knowledge they preserved required resources, skills, or conditions that no longer existed. Or perhaps the experiments did yield results, but results that were too modest or too dangerous to deploy effectively. There is one religious movement that deserves particular attention: the Church of Starry Wisdom. This mysterious organization appeared in Yi during the later years of the empire's decline, though its origins were unclear. Some claimed it was an ancient tradition that had merely remained hidden for centuries. Others argued it was a new creation, perhaps inspired by ideas from Ashai or other distant lands known for dark practices. The Church of Starry Wisdom taught that the stars were not merely lights in the sky, but windows into other realms, other dimensions of existence. Through proper meditation and ritual, they claimed, one could achieve communion with beings from these other realms, gaining knowledge and power unavailable through normal means. The authorities in Yi viewed the church with deep suspicion, occasionally launching purges against its members. Yet it persisted, always managing to survive and rebuild, suggesting either widespread support or supernatural protection, depending on whom you asked. What made the church particularly controversial was its alleged connection to the Bloodstone Emperor and his forbidden practices. Critics claimed that the church was essentially continuing his dark worship under a new name, that its meditations and rituals were designed to contact malevolent entities, that its members sought power through methods that violated the natural order. The church denied these accusations, insisting that it sought only enlightenment and that the knowledge it pursued, while unconventional, was not evil. The truth about the Church of Starry Wisdom, like so much else about Yi-Ti's spiritual practices, remains obscure. Did its members genuinely achieve contact with otherworldly beings? Were they deluded mystics, harmless if strange? Or were they dangerous practitioners of dark arts, deserving of the persecution they periodically suffered? The evidence is too fragmentary, too compromised by the agendas of those who recorded it to support definitive answers. What is clear is that religion and magic, or the belief in magic, shaped Yi in profound ways. The empire's understanding of itself, its place in the cosmos, its relationship to the forces of light and darkness, all of this influenced how it governed, how it waged war, how it conducted diplomacy, how ordinary people lived their daily lives. The decline of Yi was not merely political and military, but spiritual as well. As the empire weakened, as its golden age receded into memory, questions arose about whether the cosmic order that had supposedly sustained it was real or illusory, whether the rituals and beliefs that had guided it for so long retained any validity. In the ruins of abandoned temples, in the scattered texts of forgotten alchemists, in the whispered teachings of mystery cults, lay the remnants of Yi-Ti's spiritual heritage. Some of this knowledge was undoubtedly genuine wisdom, insights into human nature, and the natural world that retained value regardless of whether magic had ever truly existed. Some was certainly superstition and fraud, and some, perhaps, was knowledge too dangerous to preserve, better left in the ruins where it belonged. To speak of Yi in the present age is to speak of ghosts and echoes, of an empire that exists more in memory than in reality. The golden towers of Yin still stand, yes, but they no longer gleam, as they once did. The jade palaces still house emperors who claim descent from the Azure dynasty, but their authority extends barely beyond the walls of their own compounds. The great cities that were once the pride of the East have shrunk, Their populations diminished, their wealth depleted, their influence reduced to nothing. This is Yi as it exists in the time of the War of the Five Kings in distant Westeros, a shadow pretending to substance, a title without power, a civilization in its final, drawn-out decline. The political situation in present-day Yi is one of fragmentation so complete that the very term empire has become almost meaningless. There is not one emperor but several, each claiming to be the legitimate ruler, each backed by different factions and different regions, none possessing the strength to impose their will on the others. This multiplicity of emperors is not a new development, but rather the culmination of centuries of decline, the logical endpoint of the succession crises and civil wars that have plagued Yi since the end of its golden age. In Yin itself, a figure sits on the Jade Throne who calls himself the Azure Emperor, claiming direct descent from the great unifiers of old. Whether this claim is genealogically accurate is a matter of considerable debate among those who care about such things. What is certain is that this Azure Emperor controls little more than the capital and its immediate surroundings. His court maintains the ancient rituals and ceremonies, the elaborate protocols that date back centuries, but these have become hollow performances, rituals conducted more from habit than conviction. The courtiers who attend upon this Azure Emperor are a mixture of true believers who cling to the hope that imperial authority might somehow be restored, cynics who remain at court because it provides a comfortable living requiring little actual work, and spies from the various regional powers who wish to keep watch on what the Emperor Yin is doing. The bureaucracy still functions after a fashion, with ministries and departments and officials bearing impressive titles, but they govern only the capital. The tax collectors cannot collect taxes from provinces that do not acknowledge the emperor's authority. The generals cannot command armies that belong to other claimants or independent warlords. Yet the fiction is maintained with elaborate care. Embassies arrive from the various regional powers, presenting credentials and tribute, as if Yin were still the center of a functioning empire. Treaties are negotiated and sealed with the imperial chop. Appointments are made to positions that confer no actual authority. The forms and rituals of imperial government continue, divorced from any meaningful political reality, because to abandon them would be to admit that Yi as a unified empire is truly dead. In the southern provinces, another claimant has established himself, styling his regime the Restoration dynasty, and claimed the throne immediately. The second son, who had served as governor of the wealthy southern provinces and commanded the loyalty of the empire's most prosperous region, declared that his elder brother was unfit to rule. The youngest son, who had spent years at the northern frontier commanding the armies that defended the five forts, marched his troops south and announced that heaven had chosen him to restore proper order to the empire. Thus began the War of the Three Princes, the first true civil war to ravage Yi since the Azure Emperor had unified the scattered kingdoms so many centuries before. For 10 years, the three brothers and their supporters fought across the length and breadth of the empire. Armies that had been created to defend against external enemies now turned their weapons on each other. Cities that had known only peace for generations found themselves besieged by rival claimants. The bureaucracy ceased to function as officials pledged loyalty to different sides. Trade collapsed as merchants feared to venture onto roads where armies might seize their goods. Farmers abandoned their fields as soldiers from all sides demanded provisions and pressed men into service. The war was brutal and indecisive. None of the three brothers could gain a decisive advantage. The eldest held the capital and the symbolic legitimacy that came with it. The second commanded the wealthiest provinces and could afford to hire mercenaries from across the known world. The youngest had the loyalty of the battle-hardened northern armies. They fought each other to exhaustion, and in the end, none of them lived to see the throne secure. The eldest died of disease in the 6th year of the war, his body weakened by the stress of continuous campaigning. The second was assassinated by one of his own generals who had been secretly bribed by the youngest. The youngest survived the longest, but he was killed in battle during the war's final year, leading a desperate charge against a coalition of nobles who had decided they wanted none of the three brothers on the throne. When the dust finally settled, it was not one of the princes who wore the imperial crown, but a distant cousin, a minor member of the royal family who had stayed neutral throughout the conflict. He ascended the throne not through victory, but through exhaustion. The empire simply had no more strength to continue fighting. The various factions agreed to support him, not because they believed in him, but because they could not agree on anyone else and feared that further conflict would destroy what little remained of Yi Ti's greatness. This new emperor tried to restore what had been lost. He rebuilt the bureaucracy, reopened trade routes, encouraged farmers to return to their fields. But he could not undo what had been done. The empire had been fundamentally weakened. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Yi Ti was shattered. The idea that the mandate of heaven ensured stable succession had. The population has shrunk to perhaps a third of what it was during the Golden Age. The markets that once sold goods from across the known world now offer mostly local produce and cheap imports. The artistic and intellectual life that once flourished has withered. There is little patronage for poets or scholars when the imperial treasury is empty, and the merchant princes are more concerned with protecting their wealth than displaying it. Tika, the ancient city of scholars, has fared perhaps worst of all. During one of the many civil wars that ravaged Yi Ti, the city was besieged and sacked. Its great libraries containing countless texts accumulated over millennia were burned or scattered. Some scrolls and books survived, purchased by collectors or smuggled away by fleeing scholars, but the bulk of Yi Ti's accumulated knowledge was lost. The schools and academies closed. The scholars dispersed to other lands or turned to more practical pursuits. The city still exists, still bears the name Tiki, but its glory is utterly gone. Jinki remains relatively strong, its martial traditions proving useful in an age of constant conflict. It has essentially become an independent city-state, acknowledging no emperor, ruled by a council of military families. The generals and officers trained in Jinki's academies are sought after as commanders by various factions throughout what was once Yi Ti. This has made the city prosperous, or at least more prosperous than most, but it has also tied Jinki's fate to the continuation of conflict. Peace, if it ever came, would reduce the city's primary export and threaten its wealth. Trade, which was once the lifeblood of Yi Ti's economy, continues in diminished form. The merchant ships still sail the Jade Sea, still carry silk and spices and jade to Korth and beyond. But the volume is a fraction of what it once was, and the trade is now controlled by independent merchant houses rather than by imperial monopolies or licensed companies. These merchants must navigate a complex landscape of tariffs and bribes, paying off multiple authorities to move goods through territories controlled by different claimants. The cost of doing business in Yi Ti has risen dramatically even as the safety and reliability have plummeted. Foreign powers have taken advantage of Yi Ti's weakness. Korth, once little more than a trading partner, now treats Yi Ti's various rulers as subordinates rather than equals. The free cities of Essos, which would never have dared challenge Yi Ti during its height, now send their own trading missions and establish their own terms. Even the Summer Islanders, from far across the seas, deal with Yi Ti from a position of equality or even superiority, knowing that the fractured empire lacks the strength to enforce favorable terms. There are some in Yi Ti who look at this situation and see not disaster but opportunity. Reformers argue that the empire's unity was always artificial, that the attempt to govern such a vast and diverse territory from a single capital was doomed to fail, that the present fragmentation might actually allow for more effective local governance. They point to regions where conditions have stabilized under competent local rulers, arguing that these examples prove that Yi Ti's people can prosper without a centralized empire. Others dream of restoration. They study the histories, trying to understand how the Azure Emperor first unified the scattered kingdoms, hoping to find lessons that might be applied to reunification in the present day. They write treatises on governance and military strategy, compose poetry celebrating Yi Ti's past greatness, and maintain the belief that a new unifier will arise, that the Golden Age can somehow be restored. These dreamers are mocked by the cynics but admired by the common people, who need to believe that their civilization's decline is not permanent. And then there are those who have given up entirely on Yitai's future, who have emigrated to other lands, carrying with them their skills and their culture. In Korth and the Free Cities, in distant Volantis, and even in Westeros, there are communities of Yiti's exiles. They maintain their traditions and their language, teach their children the old poems and the ancient philosophies, but they have accepted that they will never return to a restored empire. For them, Yiti exists now only as a cultural identity, not as a political reality. The question that haunts Yiti scholars, both within the empire and abroad, is whether this decline is permanent or reversible. Have the conditions changed so fundamentally that the empire can never be restored? Or is this merely another low point in a cycle that has repeated throughout history, another dark age from which a new golden age might eventually emerge? There are those who argue, based on patterns observed in other civilizations, that empires follow predictable cycles. They rise through virtue and strength, reach a peak of power and prosperity, then decline through corruption and complacency, only to eventually be replaced by new empires that repeat the cycle. According to this view, Yitai's decline is natural and inevitable, but it does not preclude the possibility of eventual renaissance, whether under the Yits themselves or under new rulers who might adopt Yiti's culture while imposing their own political order. Others take a darker view. They suggest that something fundamental has changed in the world, that the conditions which allowed Yitai to flourish during its golden age no longer exist. Perhaps it is the decline of magic, if magic ever truly existed. Perhaps it is changes in trade patterns or technology that have made Yitai's geographical position less advantageous. Perhaps it is simply that other civilizations have learned from Yiti's example and can now match its achievements, making the empire's former superiority impossible to reclaim. There is also the uncomfortable question of whether Yi's decline might accelerate further. The empire has been slowly dying for centuries, but it has not yet delivered its final breath. Could something happen that would push it over the edge, that would transform its gradual decline into sudden collapse? An invasion by the Jogos Nhai that shattered what little remains of imperial authority. A final civil war that left the cities in ruins. A plague or natural disaster that devastated a population already strained to its limits. Or might there be signs of revival, small green shoots pushing up through the ruins? There are reports, difficult to verify, of one of the claimants achieving unexpected military success, of a charismatic leader who might possess the qualities necessary to begin reunification. There are rumors of economic reforms in certain regions that have dramatically improved productivity and trade. There are whispers of a religious revival, of new or renewed faith in the old principles, of priests and scholars working to restore the moral foundations that once made Yiti great. Whether any of these reports represent genuine hope or merely the desperate fantasies of a dying civilization is impossible to say from a distance. What is certain is that Yiti's story, whatever form its ending takes, matters far beyond its own borders. The rise and fall of the Golden Empire offers lessons about power and its limits, about the relationship between central authority and local autonomy, about the role of culture and identity in holding civilizations together, about the dangers of internal division and external threats. For those in Westeros who might hear tales of Yitai, the Empire serves as a cautionary example. House Targaryen, which once united the Seven Kingdoms through Dragonfire and has now fallen, might see in Yitai's story a preview of what could happen to Westeros if the current conflicts are not resolved. The various kings and lords fighting the War of the Five Kings might recognize in Yitai's endless succession disputes the dangers of their own ambitions. The Meisters might study Yitai's bureaucratic systems and wonder whether the institutions they serve are as permanent as they believe. And for the Yitis themselves, living through their civilization's long twilight, there remains the fundamental question of meaning. What does it mean to be Yitis when Yitai as a unified empire no longer truly exists? How does one maintain cultural identity and pride when the civilization that defined that identity has fallen so far from its former glory? Is it better to cling to the past, to preserve the memory of the Golden Age, even if it can never be restored? Or is it better to accept the present reality and build something new, even if that means abandoning the dream of imperial unity? These are not merely academic questions for scholars to debate, but lived realities for millions of people who identify as Yiti-Ise, who speak the language and follow the customs, who teach their children the old poems and take them to temples dedicated to the Maiden-Made-of-Light, even as the empire that gave birth to all of this crumbles around them. Perhaps Yitai's greatest legacy will not be its golden age, but its long decline, the example it provides of how civilizations die. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, painfully, over centuries, losing territory and population, and wealth and power, until finally nothing remains but memory, and the ruins that tourists will one day visit, trying to imagine the greatness that once was. Or perhaps against all odds and all reasonable expectations, Yitai will find within itself the strength for one final revival. Perhaps a true unifier will arise, someone who combines the virtue of the Azure Emperor with the strength necessary to impose order on chaos. Perhaps the various claimants will recognize that their internal conflicts are destroying what they all claim to value and agree to some form of compromise. Perhaps external threats will grow so severe that unity becomes the only option for survival. But that is speculation, hope masquerading as analysis. What we know with certainty is this: Yitai was once the greatest empire the world had ever seen, a civilization of such wealth and power and cultural achievement that it seemed eternal, and now it is dying, slowly but surely, a process that has been underway for so long that most have forgotten there was ever time when it was not. This is the tragedy of Yiti, the story of how even the mightiest empires are temporary, how even gold eventually tarnishes, how even the brightest lights must eventually dim and fade. If you found yourself moved by this journey through Yitai's long history, from its mythic origins, through its golden age, to its present diminished state, then perhaps you understand something important about the world of ice and fire, about the nature of power and civilization, about the weight of history and the fragility of human achievement. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you think might lie in Yiti's future, or what lessons you draw from its past. And if you want more deep explorations of the hidden corners and forgotten histories of this world, you know where to find them. The East holds many more secrets yet to be uncovered, many more stories waiting to be told,